Hello, class. Welcome to this online lecture on moral versus non-moral standards. Our discussion last meeting was to trace where do our standards come from. And we actually traced the possible major sources of our morality. Of course, to review, we mentioned first the family, which is the basic unit of society and your first source of morality. You remembered how your family taught you which one is good and which one is bad. Alongside our family is religion. Since our family members are also members of a religion, our family members usually teach us based on the religion that they adhere to. Your first experience outside of the family and the religion of your family is when you encounter your neighbors. When you play outside, when you get to know the children of your neighbors, and usually you encounter different standards from them. And this is the very first time that you think about what you learn from home and what you can learn from others. Next is the classroom or your school. Your school, of course, will reinforce values that you learn from your family. And if your school is a religious school, or at least a non-sectarian but teaches you values orientation, most likely values from your religion will also be reinforced as well. But let us not forget that in the classroom, you also encounter classmates from whom some other values from your neighbors could also be enhanced. So from this, remember those times when you tried to criticize either the values of the other or the values that you learned, the standards that you learned from your family. Next is society. In society, we encounter more rules, consistent usually with the values that you got from your family, of course, and from your religion. Okay. But sometimes there are situations in society that challenge our ideals and motivate us to be more practical, as it were. From there, we also have, of course, other social forms such as the recent development, social media, which also are sources of our morality and standards. So along the way, we discussed that our moral standards are enhanced, altered sometimes, mixed. So the main concern from our last meeting is, are you really sure that the moral standards that you are now applying to your everyday lives are actually moral standards? Have you examined if they stand the test of what a moral standard should be? So today, or in this lecture, we will analyze what actually are moral standards, such that if you encounter one, you can readily spot them. You can readily recognize them. And if, example, you encounter a standard that isn't moral at all, you can also distinguish them easily from a moral standard. The crucial idea here is, it is possible that you have applied a moral standard before correctly to a moral situation. But the problem is, was there an instance when you judged a moral situation using a standard that isn't moral at all. Okay, that's the crucial point. Because the idea here is, if you applied a non-moral standard to a moral situation, it is possible that you could have done more harm than not. So we must be sure that what we are applying is actually a moral standard or not. So here in this lecture, we will analyze what a moral standard is and distinguish it from a non-moral standard. First, we need to understand what morality is. Morality is a set of standards you have acquired that guide you about what is right or wrong. And these are the set of standards that you use in making moral judgment. Okay? So, let me present this as such. Morality is a set of moral standards. This is your morality, and this is your set of standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, and we need not mention how many standards you have already. So the main point here is, we need to understand and analyze and recall if all these standards that you have in that set, we call morality, are actually moral standards at all. Okay? Now, what is a standard? A standard is a criterion, rule, a model as a guiding measure for something. And usually, it is established by authority, custom, or a consensus. When we say authority, there is one person legitimate enough to state that this is a standard, meaning it is a guiding measure for some behavior. A custom, of course, is closely related to a tradition. There might be no legitimate authority that tells us that this is a standard, but it just so happened that it has been a part of our custom and culture already and tradition. And this custom and tradition lends its authority over us by virtue of practice, customary practice, and traditional belief. Consensus, of course, is as granted by the agreement between rational individuals. Now, standards are not easy to spot because standards are not objects. Okay. This one is not an object. You cannot see that as an object that can be seen, heard, touched, smelled, tasted, to say the least. Rather, you encounter standards as statements written or uttered. Okay. So, there are lots of sentences. There are lots of statements that we make that sometimes you also misuse some statements as standards. So to be able to understand which of these statements are actual standards, we need also to study the form and structure of a standard when uttered or when stated. And to guide us, you need to review the different types of sentences and statements, which you already studied in your English classes. So we have, for example, the informative sentences. You have as well the expressive sentences or emotive sentences. You have the imperative ones. The interrogative ones are also sentences, but we don't need this in this discussion. And lastly, the normative statements. Okay. So, let us study them one by one to be able to understand the nature of these statements and check whether these can be standards or not. First, informative sentences. Informative sentences are used to state a fact. So the purpose of informatives is to inform. Okay, so everything that every language you use to inform is always an informative language, although the effect could be different, but the purpose of the language itself is informative. To inform means to report the actual state of affairs. That means if the statement failed to report what actually happened, that means it is false. But if the statement is an actual, a correct, an exact report of what actually happened, then that's the time when we can say that the statement is true. So, informative sentences can be either true or false, depending on how they report reality. Next, let's talk about expressive statements. Expressive statements are the language is language used to convey or elicit some emotion. When you say to convey, you use language such that you can communicate what you feel. Communicate what you feel. To elicit, however, means you communicate to instigate emotion. To elicit, to use the term emotion from others. Well, this also includes the exclamatory statements you learned in English, like for example, yehey, I am alright, bad trip, and all that. But to expand the application of expressive languages, these are languages that used to convey and elicit emotions. So, the language of lovers, poetry, songs, all languages used to convey and elicit emotions are expressive language. Take note, however, that language used to convey emotions, language used to elicit emotions from others, cannot be verified to be either true or false. Even if a person tells someone that he or she cares, there is no way by which one can get into that feeling and investigate it objectively. That's why in expressive languages, we trust rather than verify. There could be instances of verification, like actions that actually show care, like someone brings you food, someone looks after you, helps you, but these are actually not necessary, but only sufficient at some point. Because there are people who can do that, but do not care at all. So there is no solid proof to verify that an expressive language is true or false. Remember that a statement, an expressive language as a statement, is true only if verified to be true, and false if falsified. But since that can't be done, you cannot treat expressive language that way. Expressive languages are neither true nor false. Next is imperative language. The purpose of imperative language is to cause or prevent action. To cause an action, example, keep quiet. Example, go get this. Example of to prevent an action, stop being noisy. Okay. So these are imperatives which you learn in English as statements of orders and commands. There are also no true or false orders or commands. A statement that orders, that commands, that causes or prevents action would still be a true statement of command. What seems like a true or false command isn't really true or false. Rather, these are either reasonable or unreasonable commands, proper or improper commands. The fourth statement you learn from English is actually interrogative, but it we need not discuss this entirely because the purpose of interrogatives are merely to ask questions. And insofar as interrogatives are concerned, they are as well neither true nor false. Now let's proceed to the normatives. The normative statements are the statements that contain should or ought to be followed by standard of action. So these now are what standards are. Standards are normative in form. The usual way to spot them is you find these words attached to them. You must not confuse, however, normatives from imperative ones, even if they seem to sound like similar, because normatives do not order. Imperatives do order. So standards are normatives. Normative statements express a standard of behavior that should be followed. So usually you find this in commandments. Like for example, the 10 Commandments, you see should or shall. But normatives also cannot be considered technically as factual statements to be proven as true or false. Rather, an action or behavior is acceptable or unacceptable depending on a recognized standard as measure that sets the criterion for acceptable behavior. So that brings us back to our definition of standard here as a guiding measure. Now, why do we have to distinguish normatives from the other types of sentences? Because, as mentioned a while back, there are instances when other sentences are used as standards. Sometimes, true statements are used as standards, but it doesn't matter that a statement is true means one should act on it. We need to act out of prudence sometimes. True statements may still harm in one way or another a human person. And the purpose of true statements are not standards of behavior. They are reports of actual events. Expressives usually are also used as standards. Sometimes when you find yourself in a dilemma, people would use expressive language to sway your judgment. Emotional attachment cannot be treated as standards, or emotional effect should not easily interfere with your assessment of values. Imperatives as well are usually used as standards. Orders are things that one should actually obey, but not all orders for that matter. We already mentioned a while back that there are reasonable and unreasonable orders. And sometimes orders are mistook as standards, but they are not. So, to be able to understand what statements should be used as standards, you need to understand that we are merely referring to normative statements. From here, you need to understand as well that standards are not always moral. While standards are normatives, now that you can easily spot that, the next thing you need to understand is not all normatives are moral. You can find standards in other aspects of our lives. You can find standards in games, like in basketball. You should dribble the ball by one hand. You should move the king first before the rook before castling for chess. In volleyball, you should prevent the ball coming from the opposing team to hit your court, and many more. There are also standards in driving your car. You should always bring or drive with your license with you. Exchanging courtesies with one another. For Filipinos, we say po at opo. In eating food, in praying, in writing in an essay. You need to write an essay with intro, body, and conclusion. So there are standards that are not normative. You need to understand as well that moral standards are the only standards that can be used in moral judgment. Hence, let us summarize so far. First, we ask, where did we get our standards? And we discovered that these standards are acquired from many sources. And when you were growing up, it was not, of course, your fault, but when you were growing up, you were never given a fair chance to evaluate these standards. Perhaps you were not even vigilant enough to distinguish which standard are you going to consider. So this set is actually or could be a mixture of a lot of standards that are moral and non-moral. So this set, standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, standard N, this set of moral standards, simply morality, which you use, could have standards that are not moral at all. So we need to understand what standards are. And first, standards are normatives. From here, it is easy to spot already. So statements that state a standard of behavior, usually with should and ought, are standards. But standards are not always moral. There are non-moral standards. Later on, we will clarify the difference between moral standards and not. But so far, we distinguished moral standards from non-moral standards by identifying the context they are used. So standards for sports, standards for writing an essay, standards for driving your car, standards for exchanging courtesies, these are non-moral standards but may have moral implications along the way, but directly speaking, they are not moral standards. So next discussion, our topic will be standards that look like moral standards, but sometimes they are not. So thank you and see you in the next lecture.